Hello and welcome. Thanks for joining us at the first annual Ashford University Research Symposium. I'm Peggy Sundstrom with the College of Doctoral Studies, and we're pleased to present the Research Symposium in concert with the University Fellows. I'm happy to introduce our next speaker, Dr. Kelly Ihme. Kelly earned her PhD in Organizational Development and Leadership from the former University of the Rockies in 2017. And in fact, her research was awarded the Best Mixed Methods Study of 2017. Kelly has a vast amount of experience in the specialty area of military mental health, military policy, and mental health management. Her study focused on military leaders' perceptions of their resilience, their transformational leadership behaviors, and importantly, their leadership effectiveness before and after experiencing a mindfulness-based training program. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce you to Kelly and welcome her. Thank her for her presentation today. Kelly, the stage is yours.
Thank you, Peggy. I appreciate the chance to be here. And just so everyone knows, you might notice that I'm wearing a uniform. I'm in the middle of my workday and thankfully was able to get out for lunch. But I do want to caveat that this study is in no way sponsored by the Air Force, and the opinions and the research were very strictly my own and not a professional standpoint of the United States Air Force. So I just need to make that caveat. So I want to start out today with this quote. And this, when I found this quote at the very beginning of my research, it basically shaped the theme and in characterization of my study after that. And essentially what it's saying is, one leader, one person can change so many people. And when you think about that in terms of leadership within an organization, and just sit with that for a moment, just imagine if you can help one leader be a better person, have better control over their own emotion and lives, how many other people can that individual impact positively? And so with that in mind, I went into my study, and again, this sat with me throughout my study, and what was really my purpose? Changing the individual leader, not any more global thing than that. Let's just focus on individuals. And the reason this came about was I have 20 plus years of mental health experience and being a provider in the United States Air Force. And what I noticed, particularly since we engaged in combat in Afghanistan and Iraq, is that the Air Force and most of DoD have effects of constant stress. And in the Air Force, this manifests as increased suicide rates, increased sexual assault. Many of you may have noticed in the news over the past 6 months or so, an increased firing, if you will, of commanders because of poor climates and different effects of constant stress. But we know as organizational psychologists that resilient leaders are better leaders, transformational leaders have improved follower outcomes. And if we could train these things, we probably would have better leaders. And the research does show that. However, the Air Force in particular doesn't do a really good job at effectively training resilience or in modeling transformational leadership. And the way our budgets work and oftentimes our scheduling makes it really difficult to implement new training. So my theory was, if there was a way that we could implement a training, some kind of experiential training that would specifically target individual leaders, their own resilience, and their own leadership behaviors, that maybe we could make a bigger difference in the Air Force. So there are a lot of gaps when it comes to mindfulness in the organizational setting. There's a lot of clinical research on mindfulness, mindfulness training, effectiveness, the use of mindfulness in post-deployment settings with the military, but there aren't a lot of studies relating to mindfulness with everyday workers. The majority of the military, and the Air Force in particular, don't deploy. They stay at home station or they do their combat job from the United States, in particular the intelligence community, the remote pilot community. All of those jobs are done locally at home. Combat work done in the United States. Yet we don't target those individuals when we're looking at research like this. And also there still to this day are no studies looking at mindfulness training and the effect that that might have on transformational leadership in particular. So looking at all those things, I just want to frame a couple of very specific things. My theoretical frameworks. First, I need to describe mindfulness for you because not everyone knows what this is, and there's different ways that it's thought of within the communities. Mindfulness in my research was in the more clinical context of a present-centered, non-judgmental awareness based on Zen Buddhists' philosophy. Although not religious in orientation, that's where the philosophy comes from. And it was perpetuated by John Kabat-Zinn at the University, at Harvard, or at the University of Massachusetts. So that is the context that I used, present-centered, non-judgmental awareness. What you may find in the organizational literature is the use of the term mindfulness by Dr. Ellen Langer from Harvard. Her description and use of the term mindfulness is not that which I use, nor is it clinical, nor is it based in Zen Buddhism, but oftentimes it is used interchangeably with the other kind of mindfulness. And so there's confusion in the community, and that was one of the reasons I really wanted to point out that there is a difference, and when you're reading the literature, make sure you see where the term mindfulness is coming from so that you can understand that it's either a clinical type of mindfulness versus just simply novelty seeking in a way of thinking. I also use the model for resilience that Richardson had developed in the 90s, just the ability to survive and thrive. And resilience is a big push in the Air Force right now. Do we have resilient leaders? Are we providing things that individuals need to be resilient? And then I use transformational leadership theory. The Air Force does not have a single leadership theory, which is problematic in and of itself, but transformational leadership comes the closest to the types of things that our doctrine dictates a leader should be and should do. This is just an overview of my research design. It was a mixed method, sequential exploratory design with quantitative part 1 that was done in collaboration with JA Labs from the University of Miami. They provided the mindfulness-based attention training, which was developed by JA Labs as a specific mindfulness training for the military. And then the qualitative phase was followed up with interviews from individuals who had taken that training. So my research questions basically centered around, was there a difference between the control and the training group before and after? And then to follow up, how did the participants who took the mindfulness training perceive the effects of that training on their leadership behaviors, their effectiveness, and their resilience? And some of the things I had to assume, because I wasn't involved in phase 1 individually, I had to assume and hope that JA Labs followed all the protocols, all the rigorous protocols for research, which they did, and that all the participants volunteered for the study. Because it's a military organization, there can be the presumption of coercion. You know, an officer or a senior individual tells you to go do a training and you do it. It was very stomped into everyone to begin with that no one can be forced to do this, that it's all volunteer, and that did take place. So as far as phase 1, like I said, JA Labs from Miami, the University of Miami, performed the phase 1 actual boots on the ground piece. And they included 3 assessments that I needed for my study in their phase 1. So JA Labs was in their 4th year of a research grant to study mindfulness-based attention training in a military population. And they were having trouble finding that 4th year group to collect data on. So I was able to make the connection between JA Labs and the Kansas Air National Guard in Wichita, Kansas. And the Guard agreed to participate in this study. So JA Labs came to Kansas. They did before and after testing and provided the MBAT training to a total of 73 participants in both a controlled and a treatment, what we call treatment group. And they did all the selection and everything, and they presented me with de-identified data following that for the 3 assessments that I needed them to collect data on. And then from that, I did phase 2, which was a non-probability sample of people who had taken the MBAT training, and that resulted in 12 interviews. So the 3 assessments that I used were the leadership practice inventory, the 5-factor mindfulness questionnaire, and the Connor-David resilience scale. And I chose these 3 largely because they're well-studied assessments, both in the normative community samples, but also within military populations. So there was some precedence to use each one of these. My phase 1 analysis was, like I said, with the de-identified data that JA Labs provided me, and it was simply statistical analysis. Was there a difference before and after and between the groups because of the mindfulness training? And unfortunately, the answer was no. The null hypothesis was maintained for all 12 hypotheses, before and after, between groups, which was disheartening at first. There were, as you can see on the slide, individual significance in individual subscales. Some of that was error within the subscales. For example, the mindfulness questionnaire observe scale has shown skewed results in the past for people who are non-meditators, which this group was. So having a significance in that scale really just validates that that particular subscale is problematic. In addition, all of the subscales, these 3 that had significant results, didn't skew the results so much that the overarching null hypothesis needed to be rejected. So for quantitative, there was no change. So because of that, when I was integrating the 2 phases, I went back to the assessment questions for the Connor-David resilience scale. I went back and I looked at the questions of that scale and pulled specifically questions from that scale to be interview questions. And the reason I did that was to see, was it the scale itself that just didn't show a significance? Or is there some kind of mismatch perhaps between how the questions were answered and what participants actually experienced? And after I did that, I rewrote some of my interview questions, did a few pilot interviews, and then went forward. And I also pulled some questions from the leadership practice inventory as well, so that I was using some specific language from phase 1 to bring it into phase 2. So phase 2 resulted in 12 semi-structured interviews with individuals who had gone through the entire course of the mindfulness-based attention training. And then I did a thematic analysis that I verified with in vivo. I utilized a 3 listening method. So the first listening was while I was transcribing. The second listening was while I was actually practicing my own mindfulness as I listened to each interview again, to really get the context and flavor of what each individual participant was saying, how they were coming across, and try to really be in their world as I was re-listening to the interview. And then the third was listening for trends and starting to identify coding. So the first part of my coding, as you can see with my kind of crazy notebook, was just breaking down from the leadership practice inventory specific behaviors that test was looking for, such as active listening or considering others, and putting different things participants described into those boxes. Did they describe listening to others? Okay, yes. Did they do that before and after? Okay, yes or no. And what I found from that was that a lot of people described one of 2 things, either strictly internal processes or ways of thinking, or external behaviors that other people might notice them doing, such as closing the door and taking a break, or speaking more slowly. So that was the first breakdown of how the participants experienced their mindfulness training or how they were impacted by it. And then further breaking that down were the inductive codes that you can see there. And my aha moment was while I was riding the metro on my way to work at the Pentagon, and I'm sitting there with my notebook opened to the page you see here, and just thinking about all the different things that people had been saying. And what came to me right away when I was reading was the term halting. There was a number of things that participants had said that just made me think that they stopped. They were in the middle of a thought or in the middle of an action, and they stopped what they were doing, took 5 seconds to think about it, and then did something different. And that halting action set the stage for finding the rest of the codes that you see there in front of you. And once I had that aha moment and I came up with halting, everything else fell into place very nicely. This is how I externalized, what I was thinking and how I was putting different activities and descriptions into boxes. So as you can see, it breaks out the internal processes, the thinking actions, and the external behaviors, and how they broke down into the different codes. So from a qualitative perspective, what was the result? And overall, all the participants, whether they had a huge impact on their lives or a tiny one, noted a positive trend following the training. The largest increase area was in personal effectiveness through increased resilience, which really was what I was thinking might happen all along. If we teach somebody an actual tangible activity to do to increase their resilience, many other things can be improved. And as you can see by some of the quotes, MBAT verified what I was already doing, so I could double down on those activities, or MBAT increased my self-awareness so that I can be more in control of myself, or simply allowing a person to completely reframe their own thoughts to go into a different direction and have a really profound life impact. So what does that all mean? So again, I was looking for something that would target leaders in a stressful military environment that could potentially be inexpensively distributed to the force, that would impact resilience and thereby impact leadership. And basically that is what I found. That's what happened. Although quantitatively, I considered the research a bust, there was a lot of data that I was able to gather through all of those null hypotheses being validated. First, the sample in phase 1 for both the Connor-Davidson Resilience Scale and the Mindfulness Questionnaire scored a standard deviation higher than the norm before MBAT even started. So this sample was already skewed high as far as how resilient they perceive themselves and how mindful they perceive themselves before we even started this study. And when you're already one standard deviation higher than the mean, there's not a whole lot of room to go much, much higher. So it's very possible that for those two scales, for those two assessments, there was no result simply because the sample was already pretty healthy to begin with. There was also what I noted, a very profound misalignment of some of the assessments in their questioning versus how people perceived and also behaved following mindfulness. So in particular, the Connor-Davidson Resilience Scale measures with their questions how a person perceives that they persevere over stress. So a particular question is, having to cope with stress makes me stronger. Or even when things look hopeless, I don't give up. Those are actual questions that participants rated on a 5-point Likert scale, yes, no, maybe, or in between. However, what was described by participants in phase 2 was that resilience comes in more shielding behaviors, not in whether they perceive that they persevered, but more in individual actions to buffer themselves against stressful situations, such as I'm trying to control my emotions more, or I'm taking more time for myself. So the questions that were asked weren't exactly what people were describing as how their resilience was impacted, which could also have skewed the results. And this happened with at least 3 of the LPI, the Leadership Practices Inventory Scales, the Enable, Inspire, and Challenge. and it was the same kind of thing. The way the questions were worded in the assessments was not how people described how they perceived the impact, or even in the same areas where they perceived the impact. One thing to note, the encourage subscale of the LPI was the one scale that did have a significant result. And it was also the scale where most of the behaviors that align with that scale fell under the largest code that participants described with their behavior, which was the considering code. So thinking about others, concern about how you're perceived, perspective taking, things like that. So that code was the highest noted code when I went through my analysis, and that aligned directly with the encourage subscale, which did show significant difference. So I thought that was interesting that the one place that did have the highest on the qualitative side was the only one that did have the highest effect on the quantitative side. And then the modeling subscale, and this may be a very specific military thing, there was no difference with that scale, but there was not a misalignment with that scale. However, the military does a really good job of teaching their leaders how to lead by example, how to model positive behaviors. So even though the sample didn't score much higher than the mean before and after, I think the fact that leaders are already taught how to do these things, and it was even identified by most of the participants that they had a lead by example philosophy, that there wasn't going to be any kind of significant difference with that particular modeling scale because it's something people are already doing. And the bottom line was that my idea of a mindful shield, just this vision of someone having this invisible shield around them that protects them from all of this outside stuff and allows them to be resilient and make good choices and be a better leader, was generally held up. That individuals who had gone through the course were able to become more aware of their own stress, take that awareness, think about it, buffer their behaviors to be more positive or to at least prevent a negative outcome, and then as a result, move forward. Just had a couple of limitations. Being that I wasn't part of phase one, that was problematic, but like I said, JAL Labs did a pretty good job of ensuring that the protocols were met. I only used a single base population, so in the future, would recommend using an additional base population, and that goes into my recommendations. And also ensuring that there actually is a mindfulness intervention in part of the studies. In most mindfulness studies, even in the organizational literature, they're simply looking at, is someone mindful now? And does that indicate they're a better leader here or there? They aren't doing before and after studies with an actual intervention to determine whether mindfulness makes a difference. So doing more of those kinds of treatment-focused studies, I think, would help expand the knowledge of how mindfulness impacts both resilience and leadership. And then finally, using a 360-degree assessment to determine whether what the individuals perceive as a difference is actually being manifested out in the workplace. And I did have a situation where one of the participants in phase two did go through phase one with his supervisor. And so I asked him, what are your thoughts on how your supervisor is being now that you've been through the course? And he goes, well, I noticed that he's just more calm and he seems less stressed generally. I asked him if that made for a better work environment. He goes, yeah, for me it does. So just anecdotally, I would imagine that if we were able to explore that piece of it a little farther, we would find some really rich data on how mindfulness and its impact on an individual leader is then manifested in a larger organization. So to just leave you with a closing thought, that if we can individually manage our own lives, we also would do a better job of managing or leading others. And I'm hoping that my presentation today gives you a little thought of how you yourself are as a leader or manager in your own organization, and how you may be able to improve yourself to then improve the others around you. And at this point, I leave it open for questions.
Wow, thanks, Kelly. You know, I've heard your presentation before, but I'm always impressed with how you conducted your study and really the thorough nature of it. So thank you so much for sharing with us today. It's pretty obvious to me why you won that award for your dissertation. A couple of questions and comments I'll share with you. We have about 5 minutes here. Suraj asked, based on what you've seen in the Air Force, are the Air Force stress management models appropriate for other branches with different subcultures?
So, not necessarily. The Army and the Marines do, I think, a better job of addressing some of these issues simply because their organizations are a little bit different. They're more combat focused, and they also have younger populations and less educated populations. And I don't mean that pejoratively. The Air Force generally has more bachelor's degrees per capita than any of the other branches. So just from a cultural perspective, mindfulness certainly can help, and actually it's been studied in both the Marines and the Army to effect. As a matter of fact, the JA Lab study was started with the Army in the first 3 years of its study, and the Army just wasn't able to finish the final year, which is why they came over to the Air Force and the Air Guard in particular. So mindfulness is being explored. It would just be probably manifested in different ways in the different branches because of the cultures. I hope that answers your question.
Thanks. And if it doesn't, Suraj will type in for me. Several comments praising you for the type of research that you did, including a comment, I love the phase 2 method of listening, which has really made it a wonderful study, and a follow-up comment that said, the phase 2 listening was an incredible way to use mindfulness during your research process. Do you want to comment on that and what you personally learned about your own resilience and your own mindfulness?
Yes, absolutely. So it was driving back and forth between Kansas and Colorado that I did some of that, both initial, and I actually did the second listening twice. Once was while I was driving those long stretches between the two states. And then the other times were when I was actually meditating and listening. And what I learned, number one, was that my own perceptions of what I wanted to happen in this study were initially coloring some of my questions and how I asked them, and also some of my perceptions of what I was hearing, so that by the second time around, when I was really listening to people without my own stuff in there, I was hearing people for the first time and really getting at what they were saying without that extra filter of what I was expecting. So for me, it was a wonderful experiential, what I'm trying to teach people is actually also what I'm practicing myself. So that lead by example was prevalent for me as well, just in the process of this study.
Yeah, cool. A comment here from one of my colleagues, Irene Stein, who pointed to the fact that you said, well, phase 1 was a bust, but phase 2, I found a lot of great stuff. And her comment was, that illustrates the reason for mixed method studies. And I think we had this conversation early on in your study, Kelly, when I said, when you do a mixed method study, you actually do 2 studies. You do a quantitative study and a qualitative study. And, I've repeated that to many students who are considering considering a study and really see the value of it. You want to comment on, I'm sure you reflected and thought, gee, what if I had only done, or what would have happened if?
Oh, so many times when I sat down and finally did that analysis and when I found the first misalignment of questions, I think I stood up and shouted for joy. I really did, because I'm like, oh, well, no wonder there's no result. What they're describing has nothing to do with what was asked in the assessment. And that was, the light bulb went on, and it was an amazing moment. It was a second aha moment. I had those 2, the first on the metro with the coach, and then the second with, oh my God, if I hadn't done this second part, I just would have second guessed whether it was even all worth it. Yeah. And it absolutely was, exploring that second part.